Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and welcome to today's webinar, What Can a Body Do? How We Meet the Built World, a conversation with author Sara Hendren. I am Kelsey Card, Communications Manager with America Walks, and I will be your facilitator today. I'll also be running the technical stuff behind the scenes as well. And before we get started, I just want to thank our sponsors, including the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, for making these great events possible for us. Along with our sponsors, we also want to thank all of you for being here and all of you who have donated over the years to make sure our webinar program and other programs continue to thrive. These are programs that allow us to directly support local grassroots activism at the neighborhood level. And of course, that matters a whole lot, as you all know. So if it resonates and is within your capacity, we really encourage you to think about making a donation towards this program, and there will be a link in the chat box shortly here. I also want to share a quick note about the technology before we get started. So you should see a control panel just like this one somewhere on your screen. And that's exactly where I'll be looking for your questions for both our presenter and panelists today. So after initial presentation, we'll kick off a robust Q&A session. So please do go ahead and enter any questions that come to mind right there at any point during the session. And if you would like to use closed captioning today, the link is also available in the chat. But our presenter today is Sara Hendren. Sara is a humanist in tech, an artist, design researcher, writer, and professor at Olin College of Engineering outside Boston. Her new book, What Can a Body Do? How We Meet the Built World, explores the unexpected places where disability is really at the heart of everyday design and uncovers the lessons available in all the ways our bodies connect with the material world. So household objects, architecture, urban planning, and more. Her book was included in NPR's Best Books of 2020, and her work has been widely exhibited around the world and is held in permanent collections at MoMA and the Cooper Hewitt Museums. And our panelist, Claire Stanley, is Public Policy Analyst at the National Disability Rights Network. Prior to her position there, Claire worked as an advocate with the American Council of the Blind, where she advocated for the rights of blind and visually impaired persons, both on a direct level as well as on Capitol Hill. Claire has worked previously at Disability Rights California as a summer legal extern and with Disability Rights DC at University Legal Services as a legal fellow under the PAMI program. And as a person with a disability, Ms. Stanley believes strongly in the rights of all persons with disabilities. So today's webinar is really focused on the ways that, walking or wheeling, whether accompanied or alone, getting around in public space means getting into the public sphere. And so for people with disabilities, the very fabric of streets and sidewalks and architecture has had to be remade, edited, and altered to really make moving around possible for all of us. So sharing the city, sharing civic life is not easy or obvious, but that the design of these spaces can help us build the collective futures that we want. So Sara will be sharing stories and examples of the generative, surprising, and universally human ways that we can think anew about the design of our homes, workplaces, city streets, and so much more. So after Sara's presentation is when we'll have Claire join in on the conversation as well, and we'll hear from both of them during that question and answer session. So again, don't forget to put some questions in the chat for us. And Claire and Sara, thank you both so much for being here. I'm going to turn things over to Sara now, and we can get started.
All right, I am seeing myself. Kelsey, can you just confirm that you can see and hear me?
I can see and hear you, yes.
Okay, great. So before I share slides, I just want to greet everyone in person. I'm Sara Hendren. It's really great to be here, and thank you to America Walks for your work and for the invitation to join you on this really interesting subject that affects all of us. I am a resident of Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is a dense city, always negotiating actively its kind of public planning, and a really interesting site for thinking about pedestrian life and green kind of transportation in all of its forms. Really interesting to watch. I'm also here, trained in design, work with engineers every day, connect with a lot of folks in urbanism, and also the mother of a child with Down syndrome. The eldest of my 3 children, Graham, is 15 now and has Down syndrome. So he has opened up a whole world, imaginative, urgently political world, about the way that all of our many bodies meet the world, extended and mediated by technologies and designs of all kinds. So I'll talk to you a little bit about that today. Just by way of description, I'm a middle-aged white woman with brown hair that's tied back in a bun, and I've got my very woolly winter in Cambridge white fisherman's sweater on, and behind me is a big abstract painting that my brother made, and a succulent plant coming to you from a little private office today. And I'll just show my screen and my slides now. So I'm gonna go into present mode, and Kelsey, maybe you could unmute and tell me that you are seeing the cover of my book.
Yes, that looks great.
Terrific. So
I want to mention, sorry, Sarah, to interject. We are having problems with closed captioning, and I am figuring it out right now. I wanted everyone to know that.
Thank you for
really apologize for that.
So I'm showing you the cover of my book, which is kind of goldenrod yellow and has type on it that's black and a paler yellow, and it's the title, What Can a Body Do? How We Meet the Built World, and my name. And the text is kind of bleeding off the edges of the jacket itself, and that was intentional in the design because it's also the question of the book, and that is, what's this condition of disability? It's this condition of misfitting, which I'll tell you about in a little bit. And the question on the jacket of the book is the lettering of the title too big for that book's real estate, or is the book too small to contain it? And where lies the locus of that misfitting? Is it in the one part or the other? And that is the kind of open and unresolved question that's also true in the book. So the subjects of the book are these 2 subjects, design and disability. And what do people think of when they think of these topics? To begin, if they're newcomers, they tend to think of 2 things. One is this use case. I'm just showing you a very high-tech myoelectric arm and hand, a kind of prosthetic arm, sort of the most sophisticated prosthesis that's coming out of research laboratories these days. And the kind of really strong persuasive story that's told about very high-tech innovations to do this work of replacement, to come in and be able to restore function if there had been function lost. And then in this case, this is a man's body with that prosthetic hand also wearing a wedding ring. So the kind of restoration not only of function, but also identity. So people tend to think, what's design and disability or tech and disability? It's this, it's kind of cyborg arms of the future. And that's one kind of research, and it is really interesting, but that's kind of one standard notion. There's another kind of standard notion, and that's depicted here in these 3 images, one of which is the Cuisinart food processor, just like you would see in a lot of kitchens on the left. In the middle, an image of the Aeron chair, kind of super high-end office status chair that's highly ergonomic. All of its parts bend and flex, and the heights of the armrests and so on are all calculable for the user. A lot of people don't know that both the Cuisinart food processor and the Aeron chair have their roots in disability. So in the food processor case, the little paddle handles of the switches, all of those kind of ease of use, kind of replacing knobs with those kind of levered handles. And in the Aeron chair's case, all of the ergonomic choices, a lot of those choices were originally coming from design research and aging, or design research and motor issues. So disability is at the heart of those objects. Also on the right, you're seeing the suite of kitchen tools called the OXO Good Grips. So those are probably in some of your drawers right now, those kind of squishy rubber handles with the little fins on the side that tell you where to put your thumb on, for instance, a handheld grater or a spatula or a vegetable peeler. All three of these sets of objects, and so I should say those OXO Good Grips were kind of the aha moment that got those Good Grips to the market, was a condition of arthritis. Betsy Farber in the 1980s, who was married to Sam Farber, a longtime entrepreneur, had arthritis in her hands and was sort of asking, why can't this old school peeler, those metal handles, if you're my age or older, then you know, why can't I wield this in the way that I want to in the kitchen? And that launched this much more ergonomic, comfortable handle that went on to kind of be a kind of paradigm in kitchen tools, changed a lot of the face of sort of the big box offerings of the kitchen tools. Now, so all of these three examples of kind of household products are the other story that people tend to think of in design and disability, if they know it a little bit, and that is what's often called universal design. So you take a kind of what seems to be at the margins of human experience or a kind of niche condition, and you see in it an insight in which actually there's good design waiting to be reconfigured that will benefit a lot of people. So in all these cases, these are sort of canonical in design as universal design cases. Okay, so yes, prosthetics, yes, universal design, but I am here today to sort of make a broader argument, I hope, and a more expansive argument for what's really happening in the experience of design and disability, and that is this: the human experience of getting help, full stop, and also the desirability of the experience of assistance, giving it and receiving it, some of it designed, some of it technological, some of it built, some of it in the form of human care, but everywhere that assistance might also be part of, even a salutary part of human life and sharing the future together. A lot of times in design and disability, or design and tech circles in general, the idea of the future doesn't have assistance in it of any kind, this idea of designing disability out of the world, when in fact there's lots of reasons in the whole history of designing assistance in it in a future that we want. So I'm just showing you the book covers of a number of books on this subject in addition to mine. So Bess Williamson's Accessible America, Elizabeth Guffey's Designing Disability, Amy Hamrai's Building Access, Testing Hearing by several authors, including Mara Mills and Alexandra Hui, and Hearing Happiness by Jaipreet Birdi, among others. This is a whole burgeoning field of people thinking about the very creative and tradition and the urgent politics of where design and disability meet. And then my book also joins that whole family of a lot of energy looking into this more closely in the last few years. So the chapters in my book kind of look at design at all scales. The chapters proceed in this kind of in this order. We look at limbs to look at those kind of prosthetics in that traditional sense. We look at chairs as a way to look at household products. We go out one scale from that, from products to rooms, so interior architecture, to streets, and it's streets that we'll talk about today. And then this idea, this more conceptual idea of the clock or design around time. So again, we'll get into streets mostly, but I just wanted to set up, you know, this again, a way of thinking about design and disability outside of just prosthetics or just universal design. And that is this idea of Rosemary Garland Thompson's, that the condition of disability is a body in the world that is a misfit or misfitting. And, you know, misfits seem like a kind of very slang, sort of casual word for, you know, a common sense idea of being a misfit. But Garland Thompson talks about how it's really telling, because to be a misfit, she says, is to be a round hole in a square peg world. And if you're a round hole in a square peg conundrum, it's not clear actually where the misfit lies. Is it, in other words, at the site of the hole or the site of the peg? And she would say, as a disabled person, and a lot of disabled people have taken this same framework up, that actually, is it our bodies that need to be brought to the world with technology? Or is it that the world, including the streetscape, might bend and flex some of its structures and come toward us? In other words, the movement, the adaptation might go in both directions, and it's not clear entirely where the designed assistance should actually come to the fore. And that's when design questions get really interesting. And I'll just show you some examples of what I mean by that, for example, in the prosthetic world. So I showed you that high-tech arm before, and now I'm showing you two images, two different men who are using very different kinds of prosthetics. One on the left, and we meet this man in the limb chapter of the book, named Mike, who was using one of those myoelectric arms. He became an amputee at age 14, so he's just grinning at the camera and kind of making a circle around his face with his two hands, one that's flesh and one that is electronic. And again, these prosthetics can be absolutely transformative for people who need them. But we also drop in on this man on the right, who is a 30-something man standing at the diaper changing table with his newborn baby. And Chris is his name. He was born with a flesh arm and hand on the left and just a residual limb just underneath, the tapers off just underneath the shoulder on the right. So what he's got is a kind of soft felted cords, little holster, little kind of sling that he fashioned himself to suspend his little baby's ankles so that he could do the work of changing his baby's diaper when he was a newborn. And Chris is somebody who everybody would think should be using a limb like Mike's, like on the left. He was born this way, and many doctors and therapists thought he must need these prosthetics. But Chris's story just unfolded so differently. I mean, because he was born this way, he was always from early childhood adapting. So he would take his left hand and scoop up two Lego bricks, for example, and he would press them against his shoulder, one on the bottom and one held between his thumb and forefinger, and snap them together using that shoulder as a brace to do that. And so meanwhile, all the prosthetics that were built for him were just not what he needed. His body was just outpacing the kind of function that they would require, that they seem to deliver. So this is a different way of thinking about prosthetics, which is to say, might they appear everywhere, not just out of laboratories, not just in the high-tech sense, not just that story of the cyborg future, but very ordinary tinkering and adaptations that people do all the time with their bodies, the inventiveness that belongs to themselves, the kind of low-cost materials that they bring to make their lives, to replace the kinds of functions, to do the augmentations that they actually need. So this is a kind of like high contrast story of thinking about prosthetics. But it gets even more interesting from there. So you can think about prosthetics, for instance, in the vast history of prosthetics that in the United States is known as rehabilitation engineering. That's what you're looking at on the lower right. There's a black and white image of a bunch of veterans who came back from World War II, as many did, missing partial limbs. So a lot of times there's a row of men here standing with crutches and so on who've got missing lower leg limbs or arms or whatever. And rehab engineering is this kind of powerful reinvestment after World War I and World War II, where folks were coming back from the field alive but missing parts, and giving us a huge influx of cash and research toward the best that money can buy, those kind of prosthetic limbs. And so the rehabilitation paradigm, right, of taking people whose bodies in a sacrificial way had been altered in combat, can we give them these kind of technologies to restore, function? All really interesting, and all really casting a kind of shadow over, people like Mike and Chris. Where is the rehab engineering here? So we would definitely see that laboratory that produced Mike's arm that I'm showing you now again in that legacy of rehab engineering. But Chris, in changing his baby's diaper, it's not really in quite that grand a scheme. This is a much more domestic and kind of modest and everyday use of prosthetics. So all of those things can be true. And meanwhile, in the book, we fly over to Ahmedabad in India. In the upper left, I'm showing you an image of a clinician in India fitting a young boy, in this case, with the Jaipur foot, which is a lower limb prosthesis that is not at all actually the myoelectric parts. It's actually built of very sturdy lower tech materials. And the Jaipur foot is designed and distributed and fitted and delivered all over India and other parts of East Asia, South Asia for free to anyone who needs them. They cost maybe $50 or something. So now we're in a kind of like global scale, high tech and low tech, accessible, affordable prosthetics that just, if you were to hold them up against that, super high tech arm, like how would you measure and compare the impact? I mean, here's a whole practice of very adaptable low tech limbs being distributed at global scale. Jaipur Foot has made 1.5 million of these and distributed them for free. We also look at, on the lower left, you're looking at an image, black and white image of Audre Lorde, one of our great writers, poets, and essayists who wrote profoundly about race and gender, among other things. And she wrote a book called The Cancer Journals that includes the story of her surviving a mastectomy on one side, and actually her decision to not to use the replacement breast part, the kind of soft replacement breast that, you know, prosthesis that would have been given to her post-surgery. And she tells the story of declining that and also getting some pushback in the office from the clinicians who said to her, you know, why aren't you wearing your prosthesis? And she says, well, you know, I've survived this terrifying illness. I'm good. Like, I'm in this newly asymmetrical body, and for me, it's working just fine. And the nurse said to her, well, it's sort of bad morale for the office if you don't opt in to the prosthesis. We need to see you with that story of wholeness. So now prosthetics are getting this kind of like huge family of meanings: political, global, high tech, low tech, personal, historical. They just go in lots of directions that can't be covered just by that kind of high tech story. I end this chapter with the story of Cindy, who you're looking at in the top center. And Cindy became a quadruple amputee at the age of 60, so woke up in quite a new body. And as you see here, she has had amputated almost all the digits on both hands, and so she had to figure out a way to grasp and to carry things. And in this image, she's got rubber tubing around eyeliner to make that job work for her. And Cindy qualified for one of those very $80,000 myoelectric limbs, sort of like Mike's. And it is literally collecting dust on a shelf in her house, while all these very modest tools, like that rubber tubing, are actually making her life work. And I'll just show you my favorite tool of hers, which is this cap, this silicone cap that fits over the residual limb on her right hand and is fitted with a ballpoint pen that actually she uses every day. Now, this was built for pennies out of scraps of silicone by her prosthetist for her to do something that she wanted to do. This was crucial. She could not have written in her own handwriting with that big myoelectric arm, but she could do the thing that she cared about, which is to send thank you notes in her recognizable handwriting. So I've got a GIF of her writing on a legal pad in her recognizable handwriting. For, you know, this, again, this thing that was made in the back of the prosthetist's, you know, lab, just thinking really creatively about what it is that people are trying to do. So what are prosthetics? They are replacement parts for the things that matter to us, not just the idea of a sci-fi cyborg future that's just based on functionality, but also they are an index of thinking about the human experience, again, of getting help, kind of plain and simple, and in all kinds of unlikely places, and at the behest of all kinds of different kinds of people. So I just wanted to expand briefly in that way, maybe your sense of like, where do design and disability meet? And now I just want to drop in on the topic that we're gathered here to talk about more specifically, which is about streets. The scale of the street, not just the prosthetic limb, but the kind of urban, the streets of our lives and how we get down them. And this is an image of a city sidewalk with 2 women, one walking and one using a motorized wheelchair. This tends to be the story that people think of when they think of design and disability in the built environment at that scale, that either we are doing some form of walking or some form perhaps of wheeling, and therefore thinking about curb cuts and threshold entrances and so on. But it actually gets way more interesting, again, at the scale of streets. So let me just give you a couple of interior architecture examples, but they have connections to streets to begin. One is, this is an image of deaf space. That's an architectural kind of design program at Gallaudet University. So you're looking here at a lobby of a dorm slash kind of classroom center at Gallaudet, on Gallaudet's campus in Washington, DC. And in this image, there are people walking down a concrete ramp and also seated in club chairs around kind of circular style around tables and also near wooden benches. And there's a lot of natural light and wood rafters up above and so on. And the walls are painted in these kind of soft blues, and the upholstery furniture is in kind of a medium green and blue respectively. And all of those choices actually are features of deaf space, which is a kind of architecture for deafness. So not a kind of fixing or curing of deafness in the way we might think of cochlear implants, which are used by some people at Gallaudet and not by others. It's a very mixed, varied experience, but deaf space is a kind of way of making our built environment into a place where deaf people can thrive. So, for example, those colors, those solid colors, are chosen to make high contrast with a series of skin tones, and you're looking at a bunch of different people of different races here in the Gallaudet lobby, so that the fine work of visual sign is maximally legible here against those blues and greens, as opposed to patterns, for example, or shrill white. The wood here, a student there told me, is often used for its resonant properties, and like for tapping or slapping and spreading sounds that people can hear if you're going to call a meeting to order, for example. You're looking also at, at kind of half-height walls there, so you don't need walls to block sound in kind of pods of rooms, but instead you need long sight lines to see people signing in your immediate environment at medium range and at long range. So it's really interesting how the architecture of the built environment can actually wrap a kind of envelope around a way of being. And that has also gone out to be in the public sphere. So now I'm showing you an image of the signing Starbucks, which is in the neighboring streets outside of Gallaudet campus, but nearby. And it is nothing more, nothing less than a Starbucks that is staffed entirely by deaf and hard of hearing folks, but it serves both the hearing and the deaf and every other kind of form of embodiment in the public. They serve the general public, so it is kind of the public sphere. And for a hearing person like me, you know, I would approach and write my order on a wipe away tablet and pay in the automated way, and my name would come up on a TV monitor that's mounted on the coffee bar. And neither of us, neither myself as a hearing person with limited ASL or a person who is a signing deaf staff member, needed to kind of make a lot of huge moves in order for us to be able to communicate. And so this is a kind of service design that I think tells us a lot at the scale of streets in the built environment, where a not very high-tech rearrangement of tools changes everything. Not very high-tech at all. A wipe-away tablet and a TV monitor is pretty basic, and yet the signing Starbucks does something that no other Starbucks does. Just one more kind of interior architecture example that I do talk about in the book in the room chapter is this man, Steve Sailing, who has an advanced form of ALS. You're looking at Steve in his room, which is brightly painted in red, and he's got pictures all over the walls and colorful upholstery and so on. And Steve is sitting in a motorized wheelchair that's got a wheelchair mounted, pretty elaborate tablet and text-to-speech kind of operations. Steve, now 12 years into his diagnosis, has very limited mobility. So he has eye movement and a little bit of head movement. And what you can't see in this image is that he's got a tiny cursor that's mounted on the nose bridge of his glasses that is talking to the tablet that's mounted on his chair. And that is how he constructs sentences for his speaker then to play. But that is also, by Steve's design, how he opens and closes all the doors in this residence that he designed, how he summons the elevators in his building. So when I should just back up and say, Steve, when he first got his diagnosis, did what everybody else would do with a condition of ALS and was looking to medicine for the prospect of cures, which we still await, and that he would still welcome today. But he also started thinking in terms of design and started anticipatorily imagining what is the kind of environment that I will want to live in when my mobility is quite reduced from what it is now. And sure enough, this is the result of that design. So this is one residence room in the Sailing house, which is on a floor of an assisted living center here outside of Boston. And he now lives in this automated residence. That little cursor on his glasses drives a lot of the electronics and the media and all kinds of things. For himself, he designed this, but he also, partnering with philanthropists and software engineers prior to the kind of smart home products that we know now, and designed this living space for himself and other people with ALS and with MS, and designed, excuse me, in other words, a life worth living, designed a kind of automated space where he could enjoy quite a quality of life mediated by technology. And I think that's a really interesting principle here, just of thinking ahead about not just what people lose, but the way that they adapt. And Steve's definition of a life worth living built with technology. So let me just expand then to the street with a few examples that you may or may not have heard of that are also ways for us to think really flexibly about disability and design. One is the Green Man Plus program in Singapore. So you're just seeing a man in Singapore who's got a Metro card that hovers over the call box at a pedestrian crossing signal. What that little card that it is outfitted with is a microchip that will, when hovered over that sensor, expand the walking seconds, the walking time for crossing that street. So this is at 500 intersections, I think now, in Singapore City, which makes a kind of flexible built environment for older adults who can qualify for this outfitted card, or people with disabilities, to get up to 12 or 13 extra seconds in the crosswalk just for them, after which the normative crossing time, resumes. So there's a kind of default crossing time, and then there is this Green Man Plus, this sort of extra seconds in the crosswalk. I love that kind of really elegant way of making the built world flex and bend. I'm really interested also in this robot I tend to be skeptical of like robotic promises for the future, but this is a really interesting one. It's a Piaggio product, the folks who make mopeds. And this is what you're looking at is a round, sort of like at the scale of a really thick car wheel, but so a round robot, in bright blue, that's about knee height, perhaps, on an average statured person, that follows you at a friendly distance. And it carries 40 pounds, up to 40 pounds of cargo. So here's an image of it with its hatch open and a bunch of groceries in it on the left, and then on the right, an image in a grocery store of this little robot being loaded up with groceries. And again, we can be suspicious of a lot of robotic promises, but I think this one is very practical. You can think about the kind of city users who might stay in their dwelling if they did have assistance like this for getting around in space when they can no longer carry, for example, heavy groceries, or anybody who's got a kind of motor differences or issues of that sort. I can think of a lot of users for whom this little robot would make a difference in the way where they choose to live, and also their streetscape kind of experience. I think it's interesting also to note, we all know, I think now, about curb cuts and about official ramps. There's a whole ramp activist project that you're looking at here called the Stopgap Project in Canada. It's run by a wheelchair user who's also an engineer who wanted to get this kind of murky condition architecturally solved in his home city of Toronto, and that is the single step entrance. So what you're looking at here is two storefronts for where the door is just one step up from the sidewalk. So it's a tiny little gap, and yet for a wheelchair user, it makes all the difference. So the Stopgap Project provides materials or the kind of instructions for building a very low-tech ramp out of wood, like you're seeing here, and they often paint them in bright colors and have this kind of stenciled font for stopgap.ca, and they've got a woven rope on the side for easy carrying and handling. But the brightness of them and that kind of stenciled typeface is really drawing attention to this need for these temporary ramps that are not required by law if you've got a kind of old structure like this one and you've got a small mom and pop shop. How do we solve that? And so the Stopgap Project is both a design project, but also a kind of public relations project of saying, look at this condition here. It's actually fairly easy to fix it, and it's the right thing to do for an inclusive world. Here's a screenshot from their 2013 website, and I'm just showing you this to show you the text that reads, we presently have populated the world with 2,000 plus ramps. So that's a quite successful and robust project. Again, not just in the provision of access, but in drawing attention to access. Really interesting. Just the last couple of examples. One, this is the Dementia Village in the Netherlands, which is in Weesp. You may have heard of it. So what you're looking at here is what looks like an open plaza with a fountain and people sitting in chairs at tables, and a cafe that's got a terrace on the outside and a kind of information kiosk, and in the background, just a two-level residence. This is a locked facility, and I mean, it is a formal nursing home for people, older adults with dementia of various kinds. and it operates as a nursing home, but it is designed as a simulacrum of a city. So it has an operational grocery store, it's got a hairstylist, barbershop, it's got a gym, it's got a theater. It also importantly has a restaurant that is opened to the general public of the town and also to the residents. So it's got this really nice kind of public-private way of making business, making a revenue stream for one thing, but also for having people connected to their city. And this is a whole way of thinking about the street in part as treatment. So in other words, the theory behind design as part of memory care is helping to maintain for people this kind of continuity with the familiar features of their past life. So not just memory challenges, but navigational challenges are common in dementia. And this is a way of trying to locate people in space, make them highly placeful, the things that the situations and the settings that they're in order to quell anxiety. And they have quite remarkable numbers in terms of the drop in requests for anti-anxiety medication and so on. So the Dementia Village, they have visitors there from all over the world looking at this going, my goodness, who would have thought that design could actually be part of medical care in this very literal way? Super interesting. And then lastly, just kind of in my own world, design for developmental disability in public space. You know, I mean, I think a lot about the assistance in public for especially people with developmental disabilities. And you're looking here at this group called, which is like a city year group, but they're called EPIC here in Boston, and it's staffed by young adults with disabilities, some physical, some developmental, some both. And again, it's like city year, but sort of targeted for this population. So it's a year's worth of community service, 100 hours or something, and also mock interviews and resume help and kind of basics of disability rights, all for these young people who have been quite patronized. You know, their expectations have often been quite low, and how important it is then for these young people to appear in public and to do things like cleaning up public parks, picking up the trash at public parks, helping to paint the doors at an urban high school, for example. They do that every year. And, for these young people, it's not only being in public space in a very practical way, and that is really important, but it is them being in the public sphere, not on the receiving end of help, but on the giving end. And so few people can imagine this kind of exchange in public. So I would just invite everybody here at America Walks to be thinking, of course, not just about literal mobility, but about the social mobility of people who do we expect to see in public space, and what are the forms of assistance and kind of supportive measures. And this, again, I would call sort of like the signing Starbucks, a form of service design in a way, where getting around in public space is not the literal matter, but a more kind of conceptual socio-political matter. So with all that, I'll just affirm again the desirability and the creativity, my goodness, the creativity of assistance in all its design forms, and my hope for a collective future in which assistance is desirable, and that we might build together a future with help in it. So thank you. That's what I have to show, and I'm just going to stop showing my screen and return to you, and I'll invite Claire Stanley to come and join me, and I'm hoping that Claire might add, just to start us off, a few notes about the blind and low vision community and wayfinding and city streets, and what Claire's observing in her work. I know we just have some glitches here and there around various screens and tech and so on. We'll just wait.
There we go. Can you hear and see me now?
Yeah, I can hear and see you, Claire. So were you able to hear my?
Yes, I was. Thank you. Yeah, so thank you so much. I'm glad to be here and be part of such a conversation. So like was said, my name's Claire Stanley, and I'm part of America Walks now, and I am legally blind myself, pretty profoundly blind. And so I find this conversation really exciting because the way that myself and other blind or visually impaired people interact with the urban environment, the rural environment, whatever the city or town landscape is really really profound, because if cities or towns or infrastructure buildings are designed in one way, we can have complete access, and if they're designed in other ways, they can be extremely limiting. So I'd be happy if there are questions to give examples, but just the design of buildings. One example, the school that I got my guide dog from, Guide Dogs for the Blind, out just outside of San Francisco, knows that its customers or its clients are blind. So they do things like the floor in their dormitories is made out of a material that is likely not to have a glare. So if people have partial vision, they make it so there's no glare on the floor, so people aren't going to have that limitation. They have a panel across the each wall, so if you need to trail the wall easily, there's something to grab onto. So things like that are just a few minor examples, but thinking of ways that you can make the built environment of a building or a street or a town more accessible and usable for people who are blind or visually impaired.
Yeah, fantastic. There's such good, I live near Perkins School for the Blind, which has this incredible historical archive for with tactile tools, you know, of all kinds of magical features, but also the way that they subtly, even in the 19th century, used the relative distance between the bricks and the ceiling to create a certain kind of echo in a certain kind of hallway, you know, and then another kind of sonic environment nearby, so that you could do sort of a kind of location. It's like incredibly creative, and I hope people are hearing that. I think a lot of times, Claire, I don't know if this is your experience, but I find that people can kind of come along with you conceptually when you say, like, well, this is a very important issue, but I find people miss the creativity of that.
Yeah.
You know, it's like somehow they bypass the deep inventiveness of what's happening.
And just having fun with it. At the same school, they have several gardens with different flowers. So as you're walking across campus, you experience different smells, and you're in different locations. The texture of the street below you, you know, can be brick versus grass versus cement, things like that. In my own neighborhood, when I'm walking around, I use those tactile features a lot of times as landmarks to know if I'm almost on my own street, because suddenly the pavement has changed to brick or things like that. So yeah, I agree. It can be really fun to just kind of play with the different textures and sounds and smells and all kinds of different things around you.
Thank you both so much. We are getting a couple of great questions coming in, and the first I'll kind of kick us off with is whether or not you'd say car-free or car-light streets are some of the easiest or low-tech ways to make streets work for people of all abilities. You know, this person says car-free streets are obviously simple design, and then we could work on supportive space with benches and better lighting and more rest-oriented spaces. So what do you both think about that?
I can go first. So I'm actually not familiar with too many locations that have car-free streets, so I'd be curious to learn more. But my initial knee-jerk reaction is that it might actually be disconcerting for those of us who are blind or visually impaired, because we use things like cars as landmarks and as tools to understand the space around us. So for instance, when I'm crossing the street, I use the sound of cars to understand which way the traffic is going, if it's safe to cross or not to cross, just to even know that I'm by a street. You know, sometimes if the texture of the floor is so you can't discriminate between others, just having streets gives you the concept that, okay, I'm walking down Main Street or that kind of thing. So those sounds actually offer a lot of input. So now that's not to say that if there were car-free streets and I was oriented to it, that would be great, because then I knew I was safe. But I guess just my point being that in certain circumstances, things like that are really helpful. I grew up in Orange County, California, which is very suburban, and so the traffic flow is really different. And I always said I want to live in a city because having kinds of things are so helpful. So then I moved to DC.
That's really interesting. And I've heard similar concerns from people. So just, I mean, naturally folks are going to think of like, okay, what's lost, right? So, and it's important to pay attention to that. And I know, you know, we had shared streets kind of prototyped in my neighborhood here in Cambridge, which is not car free, but was kind of 10 miles per hour, you know, new rules, and it was rolled out very slowly, 3 streets at a time. And a kind of human-centered process that I thought was really interesting to watch as a parent of a kid with Down syndrome who, for different reasons, you know, needs to think about danger and crossing and the various things that we've taught him. I will say that I think there are signals everywhere in the tradition of cities, meaning tactile paving, meaning, you know, the kind of elegant way in, you know, in the Netherlands, like I mentioned, but other kinds of countries where, you know, very elegant kind of separate bike lanes with separate traffic lights have been created, you know, in the streetscape. This stuff is not easy, but the traditions are there. And I think between tactile paving, looking at things like flex hit posts and dedicated lanes and bump outs, like some combination of the way that lots of planners have very intentionally thought about ways to calm traffic, to subtly direct people, could be brought to bear and make streets more accessible. But I certainly would, you know, underscore what Claire said and just invite disabled people to who would call themselves disabled, by the way, most of the time in the United States now, into those conversations and try to think, if you're a planner, you got to look for the signal behind the signal, because people will be asking you, well, what about this and what about that? And we are going to lose this thing that we value. Okay, what is it that we want to get done? And then what are all the vast traditions, not just in terms of accessible architecture, but all the creative traditions of subtle editing to the built environment, and how could we employ those in a new way to get that kind of sustainable future?
Yeah, thank you both so much. It obviously has great implications for, like you said, like how fast we're moving towards car light areas and how exactly we do that, and the inclusiveness of who's at the table when we're doing it, for sure.
I also think, can I just
yeah,
say one
go
other
ahead.
thing? Can I say one other thing?
Absolutely.
I just want to point to like a subtlety that I think a lot of people aren't aware of that could also be employed in this way, and that is the T in Boston where I live, you know, like at a certain point, all the payments for your cards, all that whole transaction went completely automated so that there's not a person staffed at the desk. And so fine, like if those are accessible, that's all fine. But what's been interesting is that, at least in Boston, there is now a red shirted person standing on the platform. So not at the kiosk, but at the platform. And that's quite reassuring to a parent like me, where I'm thinking that's where you want the human form of assistance who can answer lots of questions live and in play, right? So that's not something where you would be looking toward electronics or ramps. You'd be looking for, where is a design form of assistance that is this evolved human animal, right? Which is to say, it can answer the specific question at the specific time. Oh, the train is not coming, I've got to go up to the bus. Can you assist me in getting there? And I can think again of the ways that would make the city more navigable. So one of the ways of thinking about car-free streets is also, what are forms of assistance, and where would those live, and would they be human or would they be technological? You just got to be as creative as you possibly can.
Great, thank you for that follow-up. Someone wants to know if you two can discuss kind of the nuances versus steps versus ramps for differing abilities. This person's relative with Parkinson's has trouble with ramps, but can do stairs pretty well. So use cases like that.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those things where, I mean, the first thing that I sort of want to say is that I find it unsatisfying that in the general discourse around bodies and cities, it feels to me sometimes like the most creative thing that people can talk about is healthy stairs. And I think, my goodness, I mean, that's an interesting idea, but people imagine that is kind of the promised land of the future of the city. And I think bodies come in all kinds of navigational modes and capacities, and that's probably the least creative we can be. I mean, I'm not knocking it. Like, I think in some cases, in some places, it probably makes sense, but the history of the world is actually designed with lots of stairs that are hard to navigate for lots of people. City halls that never imagine a user in the winter accompanied by a small toddler trying to get up, you know, the steps. I mean, these conditions, again, of interdependence and assistance are mostly designed out of our built environment. So that's a general, let me just state that as a kind of general dissatisfaction in my watching of the way design and bodies, you know, get talked about. And meanwhile, taking for granted the incredible rebuilding of the built environment that happened with curb cuts, you know, at the demand of disabled people. And that benefit stroller pushers and people with wheeled luggage in all kinds of ways. Like bending the shape of the built environment in the form of curb cuts is a politics we enjoy every day. I think, you know, in one person's use case, you know, it's like there's no way to design a bespoke world for any of us, of course. And I think it's this kind of like, are there multiple ways to get into the building? If it's a public building where the public sphere really matters, you know, then you have to kind of, and so in other words, ramps are, of course, are not the solution for everything. It's this matter of kind of multiple modes when, again, the public sphere is at stake. So I don't know if you have other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would just piggyback off of what you were saying there at the end, that of course, you know, when it comes to accommodations under, sorry, I always put my accommodation hat on because I have a legal background, but under the Americans with Disabilities Act, you do have to make accommodations, but ideally the accommodation would be multimodal. I like that word, because when it comes to accommodations under the regulations of the ADA, they provide as many examples as possible, but we recognize that one accommodation is not a one-size-fits-all because disabilities are different for every person and every person is different. So I understand that there's always limitations with size and space and money, et cetera, et cetera. But in an ideal world, we'd have that multimodal opportunity because no two people are the same and no two disabilities are the same. And so you know, again, in an ideal world, we'd be able to have as many options as possible to accommodate people in different ways.
And I mean, it's worth saying that Zoom and video conferencing is providing some of that, Claire, is it not? Like we're precisely for whom getting through public space in general is laden with challenges. That's been a kind of opening, not just a closure experience. It has been actually, so the whole thing is to pay as close attention as possible to the adaptive possibilities that people are making for themselves all the time. And then asking, as Claire said, when the legal structures are really important to be actionable to make the public sphere accessible materially to us.
So I have to make a quick funny comment on that you were talking about with Zoom and et cetera, because for generations, people with disabilities who might have a physical disability or a health disability that makes going to work every day difficult, people have been yelling at the top of their lungs, can I please, you know, work from home? And for years and years it was, no, that's too hard, we can't accommodate you. And then this thing called COVID happened and we all started working from home and suddenly it was totally doable. And so the disability community has literally thrown their hands up in the air and said, are you kidding me? So if COVID ever ends, knock on wood, the disability community is holding our breath and is going to say, okay, so we made our point. And if they come back and say, oh, we can't do it anymore, let me tell you, there's going to be lots of yelling. So.
Oh, I've heard that. I was nodding my head vigorously. Claire, I've heard this from telehealth. Absolutely. It's not possible, and you know, yes. Magic certainly is.
I imagine that we can't quite go back there now that we have yes. exercised all of this, right? Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that, both of you. You know, Sarah, in the book, you talk a bit about the increasing number of people on the autism spectrum who would say, you know, it's not necessarily a disease that they, quote, suffer from, but something to fully embrace and utilize as advantageous and an asset in terms of neurodiversity. So I'm wondering how both of you might anticipate or imagine the ways that celebrating neurodiversity could kind of creatively impact and show up in our built environment. And you use a really great example of, I think it's Stefan in the book. So you can touch on that if you'd like to.
Yeah, I mean, so lots of people, when we have the conversation about prosthetics or whatever, they say, well, what about, you know, cognitive and developmental disability? And I certainly am invested in that in my own family, and I have a number of family members on the autism spectrum as well. And it's not a replacement part, is it? You know, it's like, what are the forms of assistance that we'd want to be thinking about? And as you say, there's a big movement. It's a complicated one, mixed for sure, and no one story is the right one, but there is a pretty big groundswell, certainly in the United States, in the autism community, to recognize neurodiversity as a human variation, right, and not a kind of thing to be fixed. So a lot of controversy around certain kinds of therapies and stuff. It's very useful debate, really interesting. It's, you know, it's not a one-sided thing. It's quite complicated. And there have been really interesting service design experiments, things like IT firms that are staffed with people on the autism spectrum, not as a kind of charity, but because the cognitive profile of autism, not all the time, but a statistically significant amount of the time, comes with, you know, deep skills in pattern recognition and sort of what's required in IT work. And those have been viable businesses, and they've been replicated globally. So in other words, rearranging the design of services with consultants that actually enhances what it is folks are good at, and thinking of the job and a good employee in a slightly different way. It's really interesting. And there are people at the Helen Hamlin Center, one of the big design schools in London, who think about architecture and autism around, you know, sensory processing and some of the other things that are not synonymous with autism, but that often attend it and come with it. I tell the story of Stephen in the book as a pseudonym of a young boy who experienced a lot of sensory overwhelm and developed a very temporary prosthesis by using tape to make linear kind of lines through public space in order to make it legible to him, and no longer uses it. But I was just trying to show this like very elegant just-in-time prosthetic at work. Claire, I don't know if you have experienced this too.
Yeah, I would just echo a lot of what you said. I have lots of friends who are autistic, I should say. That's a whole other discussion, but a lot of my friends who are autistic want to be called autistic, not people with autism, because they're proud of who they are and their identity. But a lot of autistic people have certain expertise in the way their brain works and functions, and they are just outstanding at things. And so yeah, it's not a disability, it's just a different way of your brain processing things that can really be an asset. That is me as a neurotype, or somebody who's neurotypical. I don't understand, and I don't have those you know, abilities, so to speak. So yeah, it's just a different way of your brain working. So,
and I think, you know, this sort of the most powerful critique that disability studies and disability activism offers to the world, I think, is a critique of individualism, especially productive, economic, efficient individualism. In other words, the myth that any of us is walking around unassisted, and the myth that any is actually only proving our worth by how legibly, economically organizable we are. In other words, neurodiversity is taking a pretty big swing at the idea that you hustle through a K-12 education so that you can, you know, do the test scores in this one form of intelligence so that you can become what? A productive worker, an economic unit. It begs us, in other words, disability studies, to keep revisiting what is the dignity of being human, full stop. Right, outside of those kinds of measurements and protocols. Those are post-industrial kinds of categorizations that we live by. Do we want that to describe our human worth? I mean, that is the sort of first principles question I would ask people to grapple with it.
mm-hmm.
Totally agree. I love that interrogation. Thank you both so much for your insights on that. We have a lot more questions, and we're kind of getting to the hour. I think we'll just go over a few minutes here, if everyone's okay with that,
Sure.
and get to maybe one or two more, and we'll wrap up. And of course, we'll send some of these additional questions to the panelists afterwards.
And I apologize. I will have to drop off pretty close to 3 o'clock, but so I apologize.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, you know what? I think we'll just wrap up with one last question, because our audiences really like to take away something kind of actionable, you know, at the end of these, if possible. So in terms of the advocacy realm that we are in for people first, you know, movable, walkable, bikeable, rollable communities and places, how can we ensure that our spaces are more intentionally kind of organized and presenting in ways that are all inviting and kind of breaking down these norms and the productivity stuff? You know, it's clearly critical that we take responsibility ourselves to create the space for people of all ranges of physical and intellectual abilities to join and flourish as advocates. So how can organizations like America Walks and just grassroots organizers as individuals better examine and unpack those norms that we kind of set forth when we do this work?
This is Claire. I think it's really important that starting at the grassroots level and as advocates and people who are in the urban planning space, or just any role you have, that these kinds of things are thought about and that people with disabilities are brought into the conversation. Because I don't think people mean to be my guide dog is behind me licking me. I don't think people mean to be rude and, you know, don't want to include people with disabilities. They just don't think about it. You know, like I could equally say that for myself. Like I am a Caucasian woman, so I don't know what it's like to be part of an ethnic minority group. And I like to think that I'm not being negative to those communities. I just haven't had that lived experience. So those things aren't in the forefront of my thoughts. So I personally am trying very hard, especially in light of everything, to be more intentional about those things. And because I'm so naive to that, talking and bringing people in those lived experiences into the conversation. So I'd say I hope it can be the same way with disabilities, that one, people would become more cognizant of our community and think about it, and then bring us into the conversation because we have the lived experience.
Mm-hmm.
And with that, I have to drop off, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Claire. It's been wonderful having you. We really appreciate your insights and expertise. Thank you so much.
You.
Thank you, Claire. Yeah, I mean, just +1 to what Claire said, and I would say, right, I mean, America Walks could, in its various kind of instantiations, have some pretty low level, you know, kind of community workshops where they're just inviting kind of input and feedback, and you could even, as like America Walks, which includes America rests on a bench, you know, America walks with assistance, America, you know, wheels in addition. But that, you know, I think the ethnographic, right, research that a lot of designers do is like observe people, you know, and I've been on audits in that way where you walk with somebody through their normal commute or whatever, and it's like a whole group and you're sort of just paying really close attention. And you can't, as a planner and an advocate, get very literal and hung up on, well, this person said one thing and then the other person said the opposite, and it's contradictory, and therefore it's too complex, and therefore I'm not going to do anything. What designers really do is not a kind of customer service exchange where you build what people tell you to do, is that you take in a whole lot of kinds of feedback, and then you carefully try to synthesize and see the patterns emerging there, and you do the best that you can in making a more flexible city. Like, in other words, America Walks can do well to not champion this kind of athletic use of the city so much as an embodied, and that's a big house, use of public space, right? And it's not that hard ultimately. You might be afraid of getting it wrong and it being awkward, but people, if you invite them in, just to do that, let's do a community walk through, a community wheel through, and see what people really do. Not to see, oh my goodness, how tragic and hard it is, just like how are they adapting? Because they are adapting all the time. So then you just learn stuff. But you have to stay curious, and you also have to develop that capacity to see, I often say, the signal behind the signal. There's what people are telling you, and then like, what are the patterns and the values that that stands for, and how would you then recombine those in the design of a city? It is what designers do best. So engage those designers to do it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your emphasis of that in the book as well, in terms of just, you know, getting out there and building those relationships that are important for everything that you just said. Well, thank you, Sarah and Claire, who had to leave, so much for sharing your insights and your expertise and your personal experiences. And thank you to all of you for attending and being engaged and present with us here. Obviously, a lot of profound layers to think about and apply to the work we're doing. And if you are interested in checking out Sarah's book, there's a link in the chat there for you as well. We had some questions about the brands of some of the robotic products that you were showing, so we can gather that from you afterward too and share that with everyone who attended.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you again to our sponsors today. And if you enjoyed the discussion, we want to ask again that you think about playing a small part in keeping more content like this coming your way by making a small donation if it happens to suit you. Anything really counts and goes a long way towards extending and improving our work. So you'll find a donation link in the chat box and also in the follow-up emails as well. I want to let you all know about our next webinar, the Biden administration and transportation policy. That's going to be happening Monday, February 2nd at 1 p.m. Eastern. We have a great group of panelists to discuss what the inauguration of President Joe Biden and the appointment of Pete Buttigieg as US DOT leader might mean for US transportation policy. So we've heard a lot of talks of complete streets, sidewalk construction, increased transit funding, removal of highways that divided Black communities. So there's a lot of questions swirling around what this might all look like, and of course, how we can implement and think about this conversation here today with regard to that as well. So we'll be addressing those questions in that webinar and more. And again, just thank you all so much for being here today. It's always a pleasure to spend this time with you. Keep a lookout for the survey email so you can tell us what you thought of the webinar. We really do value and pay attention to your feedback and input. So Sarah, thank you so much for your time, and have a wonderful day, everyone.
Yeah, take care. Thank you.
See you next time. Thanks.